Thank you for what you're sharing with us. I can tell already that we are going to thoroughly enjoy this course of study. I have a question about Genesis 3:15. I can sense it is an important verse, but how does it relate to the rest of the Bible?
Genesis 3:15 is very important. Most people who study the Bible, and especially the Old Testament, call this the first gospel, the first promise of God's grace to a fallen humanity. And it simply says that an offspring or a seed of the woman, in this case Eve, will crush the serpent's head. This promise really is the divine thread that connects the entire Bible. It moves from Genesis throughout the rest of the Old Testament into its fulfillment, obviously, in the final seed of a woman, that would be Christ. And we understand His ministry in terms of crushing the serpent's head. John will tell us in 1 John 5 that the reason the Son of God appeared was to destroy the works of the devil. Indeed, this is foundational to the rest of the proclamation of the gospel, that there would be an offspring of the woman who will deal with the prince of darkness. Now let's look at this in terms of what this means for the rest of the Bible. The first point I want to make in terms of this promised seed would be this: that while it might be expected that the line of this seed would always be traced through the oldest son, not so. In a number of instances, the seed promise goes to the younger son, who is given priority over the older brother. And this is foundational as we look at the rest of the book of Genesis. For example, this idea of the younger son being favored over the older brother is going to occur already in Genesis chapter 4. For killing his brother Abel, Cain, the firstborn, is passed over in favor of Seth, the thirdborn. That's, as I said, in Genesis chapter 4. We're going to see this idea of the promised seed going to the younger brother again when it comes to Ishmael being overlooked in favor of Isaac. Certainly Jacob receives the promise, and he's the younger of the two twins, as Esau was the firstborn. We see this happen in the life of Joseph, where Joseph is a younger brother, but he's favored by his father Jacob. So the first point I simply want to make on this seed, as it's initially traced through the book of Genesis, is it's going to take a pattern that we would not expect. Always overlooking the firstborn and going to a younger brother. The second point in terms of this seed in Genesis 3 verse 15, it's noteworthy that the central family line exists due to the gracious activity of God. We're going to see where God is going to provide for the family who's going to bear the promise of the seed, miraculously deliver them, care for them. The third point is this, that the Genesis narrative emphasizes this existence of a special relationship between God and the individual members of this family line. For example, if you're in this family line, then in Genesis 5 verse 24, Enoch walked with God, and he was no more because God took him away. Noah is in this promised family line, and he certainly received not only God's care, but also a special relationship. For the scripture says that Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. The fourth point I want to make in terms of this seed is that it implies a resemblance between the seed and the one who produced it. In the context of Genesis, this suggests that the sons will resemble their fathers. The classic example of this is that Abraham didn't always tell the truth. He lied about his wife Sarah, twice actually, once in chapter 12 and once in chapter 20. Isaac will also lie about his wife Rebekah, calling her his sister. Jacob is Mr. Deceiver, Mr. Liar, as he gets away with stealing the birthright from Esau, lying to his brother Isaac that he is Esau, when obviously he's not. He will deceive his father-in-law Laban time after time. And we're going to see that this then impacts the next generation, where Jacob's sons have this falling out with one of their midst by the name of Joseph, and they in turn lie to Jacob, saying that Joseph was killed. Here's his coat of many colors. It bears the blood of a ravenous beast that killed him. So I want you to see that the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree here, that the seed in Genesis is going to indicate that the son is going to be much like the father. Next, I want you to notice number 5, that in the seed, the main family lineage is frequently associated with divine promises, which are an important feature of these patriarchal stories in the book of Genesis. 3 aspects to these promises deserve special notice. First, God promises the land of Canaan to the promised seed. Second, the seed will be very numerous. And third, the seed will be the means by which all nations on the earth will be blessed. We've already highlighted these 3 promises in earlier conversations, but they are so foundational to the book of Genesis, indeed the Old Testament, indeed the whole Bible, but that they are worthy of our repetition. The 6th component that I would like to make in terms of seed is that this is a very important promise for St. Paul as he understands Jesus in the New Testament. Specifically, Galatians 3, verse 16. Paul says the promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed. The scripture does not say, and to seeds, meaning many people, says Paul, but and to your seed, meaning one person who is Christ. What I hope you've been able to understand is that truly Genesis 3 verse 15 is the first gospel. As Paul says in Galatians 3 verse 16, it points us to Christ, who will crush the enemy's head and throw him into the lake of fire finally in Revelation chapter 20. But also this idea of seed has some very important implications as we not only understand Christ, but we begin to understand the rest of the book of Genesis and how seed is going to be the interpretive link that helps us go from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and finally in the book of Genesis to Joseph. One way to best summarize the idea of how the seed works in terms of the structure of the book of Genesis is on the slide that you see. As I had indicated, the promised blessing, the seed promise of Genesis 3 verse 15 is going to jump over Cain and go to Seth, and you can see that. Then from Seth the promise goes to Noah. And Noah has these 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And you might remember that Noah, in Genesis chapter 9, blesses Shem, but then curses Ham, because Ham is the one who saw Noah drunk and naked in his tent. Well, it's really in the Bible, Genesis chapter 9. But it's through Seth, Noah, Shem that we then have the promise made to Abraham. And through Abraham to Isaac, and from Isaac to Jacob, and from Jacob to his 12 sons. And I want you to look at that slide simply because this puts the whole book of Genesis in some summary fashion in terms of this overarching theme we're calling the seed.